Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Artson, and I am the Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at American Jewish University, which is the host of this wonderful conversation with two fabulous people, both of whom I have the pleasure to know personally. And I've also had the delight of reading their book, which is really like sitting in a nice armchair with two very wise old friends, not old chronologically, but deep in my heart. So this is going to be a treat for all of us, and I want to introduce each of them for you. Abigail Pogrebin is the author of My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish. She's written for The Atlantic, The Forward, and Tablet, and moderates conversations for the Stryker Center and the Jewish Broadcasting Service, one of the great intellectual leavening agents of the world today, and someone who convenes people all the time. So no surprise that you would be part of such an amazing project, and I'm really happy to be together with you.
Thank you.
Rabbi Dov Linzer, also an old friend, is now the president and Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, an extraordinary Orthodox rabbinical school and Torah center, which promotes a more open and inclusive orthodoxy. He also has written for The Forward, Tablet, and the New York Times, published widely, and has hosted highly popular Torah podcasts. Anyone who knows the Jewish world knows that Rabbi Linzer is a courageous voice for moral clarity and for authenticity of Torah that is very deep. And so this is going to be a really exciting time, and to bring these two people together and I get to listen in is really a thrill. So the two of them have come together, proving that two is better than one, and written this amazing book here, which is called It Takes Two to Torah. And it is, I believe, based on a podcast series of conversations you've had, exploring the Torah from two very different perspectives. I don't want to just slap labels on you both. Maybe the two of you could take some time and share with us, how did this happen? And then we can also explore the differences in your perspectives and also the commonalities.
Sure. Abby, you want to start?
Sure. First of all, it's so great to be with you, Rabbi Bradley. I've been a great admirer, and I've called upon you on many occasions as a journalist, because you're such a wonderful speaker and teacher. This Havruta was pretty unlikely. I don't think I would have run into Dove socially, or even Jewishly if it hadn't been for a conference, a Jewish conference. I know you've been to many, Brad. This was it was a conference called, very appropriately, The Conversation, and it was convened by the Jewish Week, a publication that used to once a year, once every 2 years, invite about 30 to 35 Jewish professionals, whether they be journalists or clergy or not-for-profit heads, to Baltimore to a retreat. And they kind of sort of tossed us together with kosher food and said, talk about what's on your minds. And I just kept kind of gravitating to not only the same sessions as Dove, but listening to someone who, I don't want to say despite his strict observance, because I respect it and it's not a negative, but I had definitely made a lot of assumptions about what it meant to live as he does and to teach as he does. And he kept surprising me in terms of his openness to conversation about topics that I would think there were red lines over which he would not cross. And it wasn't that he was abandoning any of his commitments or his his principles or parameters, but there was just an invitation to have real conversation about things that were difficult, that were complicated, that were nuanced. And so we just kind of kept talking. We struck up a friendship that was very much about what each of us were working on. Fast forward to a number of years, I was working on my holidays book. I call it kind of extreme sport Judaism, when I wanted to understand and live for the first time every single tent pole in the Chagim, which I know you and Dove live as a matter of course, but I had never done that just soup to nuts understanding, what is Shmini Atzeret in this day and age? Where did it come from and why does it still resonate? And at the end of that journey, after interviewing over 60 rabbis and scholars, I really needed someone to basically fact check the whole thing. And Dov was my go-to, and not just because he's memorized the Torah and commentary in such impressive ways, but because I knew he wouldn't necessarily shut down some of what I was trying to get at if it wasn't necessarily as quote unquote orthodox, not capital O orthodox, as he might want it to be. He was extremely helpful there and sort of insulated me from the critics, although they still came. And then when he was working on an op-ed for the New York Times or something else, he would turn to me, and we had this kind of chavruta, and then it was his idea to talk Torah together, and I'll turn it over to Dov, or else I'll never finish the sentence. And sometimes I let Dov speak. It's amazing.
Every now and then. Yeah. So Abby it was such a breath of fresh air to be in Chavruta with Abby even before we started being in Chavruta in terms of the Parsha podcast, but to be talking to somebody who is passionate about Judaism, curious about what I had to say. That's always good to talk to somebody who's interested in what you have to say, but also really would come back with deeply thoughtful questions, and that would push me to think harder and open up. And it was a wonderful dynamic. And then when I became, 5 years ago, I became the president of Yeshivat Chovei Torah. Before that, I had been the Rosh Yeshiva, which is the rabbinic head, the scholarly head. But now I took on the responsibilities of the institution. And at that time, I realized that I really had to be being more in conversation with the larger world, because one of the things that is unique about Chovevei for an Orthodox institution is that we're training rabbis to really be rabbis, not just for the Orthodox community, but for the entire Jewish people, and to take the tradition and the Torah and the deep scholarship and translate it into the modern day and into the realities that face us. And even though that's what our students and rabbis have been doing, and like we have 150 of them, and they're just so successful, and I was training them as the Rosh Yeshiva, but I never left the walls of the Beit Midrash. Not never, I mean, I was in this conference with Abby, but figuratively, almost never. And now that I was becoming president, it was like, I also have to step up and I have to be doing this. And I think that's probably what prodded me to say to Abby, we so love being in conversation about real issues, Jewish issues, and so on. What if we did something on the Parsha, and we did it together, and we did it as a podcast? And Abby loved the idea. Tablet Magazine was, hosted it and gave us a great producer. And that was called Parsha in Progress. And we did that for 2 years, every other week. So at the course of over 2 years, we had completed the whole Parsha. And 10 minutes each, very short, distilled. We took just one topic, weren't trying to cover the whole Parsha. And after 2 years, we got great feedback, but I figured the project was over. But Abby kept on hearing.
No, I just want to correct. You said after 2 years, we finished the whole Parsha. You mean we finished the Torah?
I'm sorry, I misspoke. Right. We did every other Parsha, whatever. So over 2 years, we had covered every Parsha in the entire Torah, each with 10, in short 10-minute pieces. And yeah, Abby, why don't you take it over in terms of what happened then afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think we heard from a lot of people who said we loved listening to you, but we couldn't necessarily keep up. We sometimes missed an episode. And I would also like to go back to it, maybe use it myself in my own kind of like Torah thinking, but also see it in its full arc, like the entire kind of chronicle of the conversation. And I don't want to have the, sound so chutzpahdik as to say, that we were so brilliant. I think what was fresh about it was that this was a real-time conversation where we were having to engage with what was happening in the world between 2018 and 2020, which meant we had to, deal with a racial reckoning after George Floyd, deal with the travel ban and how that intersected with ideas of welcoming the stranger, confront the pandemic, which, suddenly Tazria has a whole new, it used to be kind of, the albatross for any bar mitzvah is suddenly, roaring to life in such complicated, interesting ways. I mean, we were really interacting with the world and Torah in the way that so well Torah does, but many Jews who come from what I come from, which is not necessarily an strictly observant life, don't always see how the verses, when you engage them, are almost miraculously speaking to wherever you are, whether that is something that's happening in the world or that's something happening, if I'm losing my father because he's sick. There were so many moments where Dove and I suddenly had to kind of reckon with not just the text, but the Torah of the world in real time. So we decided to test out whether it worked on the page. We were really surprised that it kind of had its own life. Even though it is a conversation, in writing, it's Dove talking and me talking. And as Dove points out, many people who have thankfully enjoyed it say that, they're reading and they're like, I really agree with Dove here. And then it's like, well, maybe Abby's convincing me. I like to think I'm winning, but it's not a contest.
No.
Well, look, I think that the beautiful thing that you said is that the astonishing nature of Torah is that it more often than not ends up speaking to whatever you bring to it. And there's wisdom to be unpacked from a host of perspectives without any a priori commitment. So even a total newcomer can see themselves and their life illuminated in what's in it. And I love the fact that the two of you don't try to mold into a single consensus, that the Torah is greater when there are multiple approaches to it, because then there's more to unpack out of it. So I'd love to hear you think with us together about that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask us to put aside our labels for a minute. So
Amen.
I think there's a way in which Orthodox and conservative and Reform speak to institutional natures. But let's just sit together in this amorphous, non-existent, aspirational place in which we're just Israelites wandering together and receiving Torah. And what I'd love to hear is, what are the things you brought to Torah that were unique to your background, temperament, personality? And what were the ways, I'm going to ask you afterwards, so don't answer this yet, but I'm going to ask you, how have you changed because of the encounter?
Right. Can you say the first question again? I got the second.
So what did you find in this unpacking of Torah? What is an outgrowth of what you brought to it, your own Jewish commitments, Jewish identity, life background? I'm a big fan of your mom, Abby.
Thank you.
So we've all been influenced by your family.
Thank you.
So how did all of that you bring, what did that allow you to see and to unpack?
You want me to start, Dove, or do you want to start?
Maybe I'll start. First I want to thank you, Brad, about the point about putting our labels aside, because I think, while the subtitle of the book is an Orthodox rabbi and Reformed journalist discuss and debate their way through the 5 books of Moses, right? That was a helpful way of giving a sense that we're coming from different places. But one thing that's so true about the book is that we don't represent anything other than ourselves. I made the mistake in a very early exchange to say to Abby, so Abby, as a Reformed Jew, what do you think of this? And Abby said, I do not like that framing as a Reformed Jew. I'm just going to answer as a Jew. And, in so many ways, we would break the mold. And I at one point said to Abby, yeah, I don't really, the parsha was Truman about building the sanctuary. And Abby was talking about the beautiful sanctuary at Central Synagogue. And I said, yeah, I don't really get inspired most of the time by praying in a synagogue. For me, I want to be praying outdoors and in nature. And Abby said, you're an Orthodox rabbi. You're not allowed to say that. But it was like,
I don't sound that high pitched.
Okay.
No. We got that. But look, I think what you're pointing to is really important. And then I want to hear the rest of your answer.
Yeah.
Orthodox, Reform, Conservative are approximations. They're sometimes useful approximation, but something gets lost in any label. And anyone who's met 2 Orthodox Jews know that they're not identical, and 2 Reformed Jews aren't identical, and none of us neatly fit in the parameters of some denominational creed. So as you, Dove, what did you bring to it, and what did that allow you to unpack?
So I think, Abby has helped me appreciate that one of the things that I bring to it, which I just took for granted, but as a relationship to the text that sees it, because I see it as divine, coming from God, it means that, and binding on me, I have to see it as good. Not that I have to see every story about the patriarchs or the matriarchs, that every character is good. Characters are human and flawed. But if God acts in certain ways, or if there are mitzvot, divine commandments, things that the Torah is saying, God is saying, those are things that, to me, if I believe that it's from God and I believe God is good, then I have to believe that that's good. And I think I am unusual as an Orthodox Jew, or maybe as an Orthodox rabbi, that I am honest with myself when I don't find that to at least feel like it's the case. Like when I find something that's morally problematic, I'm saying, I really struggle with this in terms of how is this ethical, how is this good? And I allow myself to ask that question, which I think is unusual for, as I said, for an Orthodox rabbi, but then I really work to find an answer. I can't leave it as a question, and I can't conclude by saying, this is unethical, this is not good. That's not an acceptable answer for me. So Abby has helped me realize how that orientation and that set of commitments sometimes, I think, pushes me to find sometimes surprisingly powerful, positive sort of things in something that would have looked negative, but sometimes to pretzel myself, as Abby would say, to make something fit. And to realize that even if I feel Abby has helped me realize that even if I feel I've resolved it for myself, maybe I haven't really fully resolved it. So I would say that's one particular set of commitments that really played out throughout.
Wonderful. Okay. Abby?
Yeah, and first I want to just echo what you said, Brad. That's so true about the silos of our labels. And it's not that I don't think that the labels are meaningful because they obviously amount to commitments, but I have found that the labels often get in the way of what I have been lucky enough to discover, which is the cross labeling of teachers. Like, I learned from you, and I learned from Dove, and I learned from, Sharon Grouse, and I learned from, Avi Shafran, who is, at Aguda and probably is as, antithetical to my ideology as anyone. That's what I'm allowed that as a journalist, but it also enriches my Jewish life and my Jewish thinking. It doesn't mean I'm going to pray the same way or believe all of the same things, but I sometimes feel like we're so dug in and sort of this is my lane, that it actually cuts us off from just sort of the richness of the laboratory that you all offer. So that's just my soapbox on labels. I would say just, picking up on what Dove said about, God was a big discovery for me in this journey. And it's not that I didn't feel a relationship with God. Very honestly, I will reveal my Jewish therapy. I am a believer. I am a person of faith, but it's not so much organized around this book obligating me. And to talk to someone where this text is, it's not that it's a blueprint of life for him, but it is sacred in a way that it commands him. He feels commanded by it. And as he said, has to reconcile it to the positive, was just really kind of mind-blowing, because I just hadn't ever come to the text with that necessity and with that kind of that sense of it being untouchable in a certain way. And I don't mean like Dove stomped his feet and said, Abby, we can't talk about that. But I could sense that I had to be careful about the language that I used when I was reacting to the text, because ultimately a divine text for him, and he can speak for himself, but this is what has changed me, is the idea that if God is involved, there's almost a sense of God is watching as you discuss God's words. And that was really new and sometimes hard, but also kind of meaningful. Not kind of meaningful, very meaningful.
So I want to, if I could, ask each of you a tough follow-up to what you said, because what you said is so beautiful. And I find myself, God, the stereotype is awful. Here I am, the conservative rabbi in the middle. Thinking, oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, and I grew up in a fairly non-observant household, which, looking back, offered a lot of benefits. One of which was I didn't have a bad Hebrew school experience to get rid of. I kind of came to it as an adult, and the freedom I had as someone who grew up as a Reformed Jew has allowed me to look at Judaism in my own terms, but I've become pretty traditional in many regards. So Dov, I'm close to you in the sense of at the end of the day, I'm not prepared to say the Torah is wrong.
Mhm.
I am prepared to say it's been misunderstood. I'm even prepared to say it was understood correctly for 1,000 years ago, and now God is giving us a new understanding.
Mm.
So what I want to ask you, because I assume more in one way or another, you would agree with that more than not. So I want to ask you the hard question. And the hard question is, has there been any place where you couldn't get the Torah to good? Are there places it's so bad and you try all the pretzeling that you can do? And pretzeling is an honorable and dignified thing. I just want to say, since Abby mentioned Rabbi,
You're very pro-pretzeling.
well, I want to point out that in Los Angeles, we have pretzel challah. And at
We
Ikar,
do have that in New York as well.
and at Ikar, which is the minyan we go to, they're smart enough to serve mustard with the pretzel challah, which if you haven't had, first of all,
It's a game changer.
it's a game changer, and it means you never have to go to a ball game ever again, which for me is a plus because then more time for Torah study. Okay, so Dov, are there times where the admirable Jewish activity of pretzeling
Yes.
leaves you still with this is still yuck? This is still
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to, again, as I did, I want to comment just briefly on the first thing you said, and which is about a new interpretation that God is asking us, to find in the text nowadays. One of the hardest texts, which is, of course, the Akedah, asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. I often will deal with that by saying, I think that the lesson is at the end. Maybe this also answers your more immediate question. The lesson is not at the beginning of the story. The lesson is not when God tells you to sacrifice your son, you listen to God. The lesson is at the end of the story, because what happens at the end of the story, he's about to sacrifice his son, and an angel calls out and says, Avraham, Abraham, and he listens and he turns, and the angel says, don't raise your hand against the child. Now, Abraham could have said, I heard from God I was supposed to sacrifice Isaac. I'm not listening to some angel to override what God directly told me. But he actually understood that even if the angel's voice was the smaller one, was the more silent one, he had to be listening to that voice. That if you think God is telling you to sacrifice your son, you need to realize that you need to listen again and that you're mistaken. And I think that that's what the Torah is sort of teaching us in the story of the Akedah. And that's our responsibility to, if we think that the Torah is saying something that is, wrong and unethical, we have to listen harder to the smaller voices and maybe give a different interpretation so we can truly understand what the Torah is saying.
great. And that is an excellent volley back. And a bit of a dodge. So
I will answer your question. I needed to share that because that speaks very deeply.
Well,
that's the preamble.
And now you're in trouble. You're in trouble.
Any rabbi, my wife says it takes me 10 minutes to clear my throat.
Exactly. You're in trouble when the rabbi says, before I give my sermon, I'd like to say a few words. So I will say that, I think some of the texts that remain can't really understand them is when God, the divine punishment sometimes that God brings to people. I'm sorry about the siren in the background. I'll let that pass. Nadav and Abihu, two of Aaron's sons, bring a sacrifice out of a moment of religious inspiration, and they might have done something wrong, but a fire comes out and they're killed. The children of Israel grumble and complain, and they stuff themselves with the quail, and then they're all killed. Some divine plague, and that's disproportionate and very hard to understand. Of course, you could say maybe they were slaves, they needed a strong arm, but in the end, I can't come to really terms with it to say I really understand it. And then there's also a really challenging issue that we dealt with around Sota, but maybe I'll pause and let Abby respond, and then we can come back to that.
Okay.
I'm going to get a different hard question, aren't I?
You are.
You have the same question I do, Abby.
You get your very own question. Which is, if you don't see it as divine in a different way than other literature, then why do you keep reading the same? You wouldn't keep reading Gilgamesh every week. I assume you like Shakespeare, but once or twice is kind of covers it and you're done. You come back to this book again and again, and I haven't asked the hard part yet. The hard part is you get to the foot of Mount Sinai, and the character God in the book of Exodus says, okay, we're going to have what is the most important moment in Jewish history. I am going to reveal the Torah, so stay away from your wives, which at that moment reveals that as much as you'd like to stand with us around the mountain to receive Torah, you're supposed to be home making the cholent, because we're going to be hungry after we get Torah, and you are responsible for that. So why are you still reading this book over and over again? There are a lot of good books. I can give you a list of some really good books.
I'm an English major, so I'm ahead of you. Or maybe you are too.
I was a history and lit major.
It's such a good question. I think first I should just modify that even though I don't think of it as divine in the same way, it doesn't mean that I don't think of it as its own species.
Okay.
So it does kind of cast it. I feel responsible for it in a certain way, which is different than feeling commanded by it. But in terms of your question, I think I am going to just bring up my mom, because you were kind enough to do that first, so that people who don't know who my mom is, and thank goodness she's still with us at 85, she co-founded Ms. Magazine in 1973 with Gloria Steinem and co-created Free to Be You and Me, which I hope some of you remember, as a record and a book with Marlo Thomas. But she's also one of the first, I think, Jewish feminists who said, I am not going to abandon my tradition and my practice, but I have to somehow find an egalitarian path. And, she was raised very observantly in a conservative home, and she still likes her melodies. Like, she is not at Central Synagogue with me. I love Central Synagogue. She loves it too, but she's at her conservative synagogue. She wants to hear her music and have her rhythm of any service. And she needed to find a way to see herself in it and not written out of it. So, that she's done that work. And part of it was the feminist Seder, and part of it was, the degendering of prayer books. But she's still a kind of a traditional Jew, probably more even than I am. I would say, though, I really, this is not just being defensive and a disclaimer. And again, getting back to my Jewish therapy of cutting off from my mom, I didn't want to go into this as the feminist interrogator of the text. I wanted to go as Abby, who is reacting to what we're reading together and talking about. And sometimes issues came up that were difficult in terms of where a woman is written out, or the Sota ritual, which I think is so degrading and demeaning and indefensible. But it was so often Dove who kind of pushed me to come back to the issues that brought up. So it's a long way, again, of getting to your question of, I feel like if anything's happened to me on this Jewish journey, and I did come to this all later than the two of you, it's that the incredible magic of being able to essentially get on this bus late and realize that it's a party on some level. Like, it's just this incredibly alive, incredibly animating, often heart-rending thing. So it's not always the happiest party, but there's just this incredible conversation that I have the privilege to be able to join, and that people like you and Dove have said, it's not too late. Come on board wherever you are. That sounds very Hallmarky or Oprah-y, but that is really powerful for me. And so I am playing catch up in a certain way, but I've seen the dividends that it offers. I've seen that coming at this Torah when we did in 2018 and now revisiting it post October 7th, it's a completely different book. That's part of I think why it endures, is that it just changes wherever you are. So.
Beautiful. So the next thing I'd love for you to, if you're willing to explore, is having danced this dance together all this time.
It's a tango, you might say.
Although we do not touch.
Sorry.
Thank God. I was
Now you
nervous.
get Dove's sense of humor, and imagine what that's like on the road.
I can only imagine that's going to be the next book, The Wit and Wisdom. So can you share a place where you each changed your understanding of Torah because of the insights of the other?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean abandoning your initial position, but it means it deepened, it shifted, something came up that you hadn't been able to get to on your own, that because of your conversation, you said, oh, I now see something there that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
Do you want to go?
Go first? Do you want me to go? All right. So I'll start. There was a moment really at the end of the Torah, towards the very end, in Parshat Shoftim, where the Torah is commanding the king to write a Torah scroll. And it says, he should write the scroll and it should be with him all the days of his life. And Abby said, I so love this passage because it's teaching you the lesson that no matter where you are and who you are and what position of authority you arrive at, the importance of being a lifelong learner. And I said to Abby, what do you mean? Like, where is that in the text? So she said, it's right there. You have the scroll, you read it all the days of your lives. I said, I always was reading it only in the context of the end of the verse, because the end of the verse says, in order to fear the Lord his God. So I was seeing it purely as a regular reminder that, you're under God, even when you are the prime authority of men, you remain under God and the laws for everyone. But Abby really made me realize that, having the text with you at all times, to read that as being a lifelong learner. And so much, I think, of what, my life has been and Abby's life has been since she began this, her Jewish journey so many years ago, has been about being inquisitive and asking and always learning. And it made me realize that, even as a lifelong learner, I still had to learn the lesson of being a lifelong learner.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Dove. As the young people would say, I would say, Dove really kind of shifted my thinking on mishpatim around the stranger, because I was raised, to go back to my liberal Jewish upbringing, with a really strong orientation that we say it 36, that it appears 36 times in the Torah. We were strangers. We should welcome the stranger. And that was oriented towards the other, meaning the non-Jew, like the person unlike us. And Dove was kind of like, I hate to break it to you, but the tradition, the rabbinic reading, meaning capital R, is that the stranger is still a Jew. It's the convert. And he can explain why that was their framing. But I was like, are you kidding me? Like, you're basically saying that this kind of outward compassion and invitation is not to the person unlike us, but to still within our own family. Like, that's just such a complete shift that I'm still getting my head around. But what I will say, and it worried me about the insularity of that message, frankly, on a serious note. It made me feel like, oh, this just confirms that we're just out for ourselves. Then October 7th happens, and we can get there or not get there. But I just saw this suddenly so differently. The conversation, the disagreement that we'd had, or the fact, or the eureka that I'd had, really kind of came back, where I said, it's not that October 7th has taught me, like, yeah, we should just only worry about each other. But it has reminded me that sometimes our outward orientation has, at least in my case, made me sort of fail to confront the fact that sometimes we do need to be for ourselves, because other people are not necessarily having the same orientation of humanity, shared humanity that I was raised to have. And it doesn't mean I'm going to abandon mine, God forbid, although sometimes that's been tested, that compassion has been tested. But it did come back to, do I sometimes have to be a little more oriented towards my own people?
Beautiful. And I just want to comfort you, Abby. The Torah also commands us, v'ahavta et hager, that you have to love the ger, which is the non-Israelite with whom you live. So you still have a verse to fall back on.
Thank you.
There's my job in the middle again.
It really helped.
Yeah.
You're Switzerland.
I'm going to take that as a compliment, although you seen me in lederhosen, so you might want to hold back on that. So this is amazing and wonderful, and I'd love to also hear what was the most interesting conversation you two had. And you may not agree as to what it is. You're allowed to have different. This is the one that stands out to me. This is a conversation that really came alive for me. Share that.
I mean, I have one. Do you have one?
I can think I have one.
You can go.
Oh, thank you. I think one that we were really clashing for a good while and not being able to get what the other person was saying was around the verse in Tzav, in Leviticus and Vayikra, where it says, a continuous fire, Eish Tamid, shall burn on the altar. And, that's sort of like also like the idea, like the Ner Tamid, the continuous flame, the eternal flame that burns on the menorah. And Abby said, that he finds this a powerful image of Jewish continuity and the importance of Jewish continuity. And I responded and I said, Jewish continuity does not do it for me. It's not a concept, that inspires me, that motivates me. I know we're always talking about like the importance of Jewish continuity, the Federation or whatever is invested in that, but I think we have to ask ourselves, why be Jewish, as opposed to just focusing on, on the importance of continuing. Why are we continuing? What makes it important? And to me, that ultimately that will ensure Jewish continuity if we have an answer to that question. But the idea doesn't motivate me. And I think with the back and the forth, I started to appreciate that it wasn't just the concept of continuity, but it was really the concept of resilience. No matter what has happened to us, we as a people and our resilience. And that is an idea, especially since October 7th, that we really have to draw strength from. So that was a really conversation where we are pushing each other till we came to a deeper understanding.
Nice. That's great. Okay, before we go to you, Abby, though, one follow-up of, you do live a Judaism that is deliberately resistant to sweeping change.
Mm-hmm.
I use my word carefully.
Yes, I appreciate the modifier.
Doesn't it occasionally give you pleasure to think, I'm doing what my great-grandparents were doing? I'm saying the prayer the way they said it. I have my great-grandfather's tefillin, the prayer phylacteries that you wrap on your head and your arm. And the fact that I think my great-grandfather put these on and I'm now putting them on, that there is something to that continuity that I find profoundly inspiring. Does that not speak to you?
So thank you. That's sort of a continuity that you're at the end of the chain. And usually the word I would use for that is tradition, being part of a long, tradition that's handed down. But yes, framing continuity that way very deeply speaks to me. I think often when I hear people speak about continuity, it's important that our kids marry Jewish, that the Jewish people continue on in the next gen. It's pointing forward rather than backwards. And I agree that it's important that we continue on, but I don't think we're going to get that by talking about continuity. We're going to get it by talking about the values of Judaism and why be Jewish.
Well, I actually think what we mean by that is that I grew up feeling guilty and insufficient, and too, because that has kept our people going across the millennium.
Well said, well said.
I have no idea how hard that is in California to try to convey. Abby, how about?
I would go with Hukat. And basically the overall, because it's not just that parsha, the idea that Moses does not get into the promised land. I knew it, but once we were unpacking it, it just felt so unjust to me. And basically because we really had followed just how many times Moses was kind of doing everything that was asked of him, not kind of, and didn't want the job in the first place, tried to demur when he's at the burning bush and God says, please go do this. And Moses says, I don't think I'm your guy. And he says, yes, you can handle it. And I'll give you Aaron to help you. And, it's not easy to get the people out. And then he does, and they are fetching every step of the way. I don't have to tell you. And it was better in Egypt and the food's bad and it's hot and whatever. And obviously the golden calf, and they doubt and doubt and doubt, and they build an idol and they don't wait for Moses and get impatient there. And, and then they, there's a mutiny with, Korach. I mean, there's just so much thanklessness, and he stayed the course. And then, okay, he hits this rock. I mean, it just felt like, what was the sin that he can't get there? It's like he did everything that was asked of him. And I just felt like as a moral, like, to take away the lesson there, I couldn't reconcile it. I still kind of can't. And it was interesting to hear Doe's rejoinder, and we've talked about it a lot since. And part of it was that we need new leaders. And I really get that. I have seen, just even on the synagogue level, there are rabbis who don't leave, or corporations, there are CEOs who don't leave. But it just felt like, doesn't he get to taste it? Doesn't he get to see it? It just felt tough to me.
I'm sorry, the rabbi and me, I can't hold back here.
Please.
I'm going to join this conversation. The Torah and the Tanakh both have the same cycle. So the 5 books take you right to the boundary of where you're going to go, and then you immediately start up again. You never get to the goal. And the Tanakh as a whole ends as we have left the land and are about to return. Cyrus, go back. So both the little journey and the big journey.
I love that.
Beautiful.
You don't make, and the thing is, you're right to resent that, but that is the human condition. We won't arrive at the goal.
Oh, that's amazing.
We do our part, and then we will pass it along, and we have to trust others that they will take the journey forward. So the question is, were you true to the journey while you were on the journey? And did you prepare the people who would keep doing it? And so I think you're right to not like it. Is a tragedy that Moses doesn't get to go in, but it's a tragedy that you and I will face one day. And adjust to that and know that that's just how we humans live. I think
that's incredible.
Makes the beautiful, really, really beautiful. Thank you.
That's actually really helpful personally too.
Good. Happy to do it. So let's lift up from the book a little bit. And I want to know, are you different now than you were when so before not only the book, but the podcasts? Are there ways that you are changed?
Yeah.
I could start there. Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think that in a very unexpected way, just this journey and people's reaction to us has changed me. And I think part of it is I didn't realize how rare it is to kind of cross this river. And I don't want to say like people are like, oh, this is the most amazing thing, but they keep saying that in this time of so much acrimony and so much kind of demonizing of each other, the fact that two people who really think differently and do things differently and could disagree on so much, and frankly, even in our Jewish world, as much as I love it, we manage to splinter ourselves kind of expertly, which is always mind-boggling to me. And just, I think the generosity that we have for each other, and then just frankly, the book tour, which has made us confront our differences in how we travel, in how we eat, in when we arrive somewhere. And I mean, all of that has just been a reminder that it's not simple. It's not just that we sort of dance off into the sunset together. There are times where we come up against things that are, we were interviewed by Jody Redoran of the Forward early on, right before we started our book tour. And she said, so it's really interesting and amazing. You're going to be going to these Reform synagogues on Shabbat, Dove. And he was like, oh, could you not print that? Yeah. And I said, what are you talking about? Like in real time, I was kind of like, are you kidding me? We're talking to a journalist right now, and you're asking her not to publicize. Like, why is that something you're ashamed of or something that's problematic? And he explained to me that kind of in the Orthodox world, who you are is where you pray on a Friday night. It's not that he's never been to a Reform shul, but to sit there on a Friday night was kind of like, that was a little bit of a marker. That was just one moment where I was kind of like, Dove, are you kidding me? And he came around, and he can say why, but there have just been some moments like that. Someone, I think he allows me to say this because he has said it publicly. One of his supporters at YCT said, Abby admits in the introduction that she doesn't keep kosher. So you're kind of koshering something, that we don't want to support. And, each one of those things is a little bit of a cut, but I'm a grown-up Jew, and I realize that these are people's lines. But just even that, and doing it anyway, and continuing it anyway, and figuring it out together, I think has changed me.
I'll pick up where Abby left off. I would say that speaking with Abby and having this Torah conversation was something that came naturally to me. I'm curious. I am a lifelong learner. I love being pushed. Abby and I have a wonderful relationship and dynamic. But when that question was asked about which synagogue you're going to go to, I realized that I had not confronted an area which I actually had a line, or actually was concerned, had a degree of taboo, and how will people react. And at that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. Either I was going to hide from it, or I was going to own it. And I decided to own it, and I decided to say, to heck with how people react. What we're doing here and what we're representing about coming together across differences and connecting to Jews, everywhere. And Orthodox, somebody who's, if I don't represent Orthodoxy, but I'm an Orthodox rabbi, and being in respectful conversation with rabbis and Jews from other denominations, like, I'm just going to own this, and to heck with whatever, whoever wants to give me flack. So that was, I think, a really growth moment for me, a very significant one. And I will say that also, continuing on the book tour, I've been in more conservative and reform synagogues in the last 2 months than I've been in my entire 58 years of life prior to this. And as Abby said, during services and so on. And that has been a broadening experience for me. It's expanded my horizons. And even though I've really always been a pluralist, and I believe, that we're all doing God's work, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, I think it had been more intellectually, and by when I went there and I saw, how the services were meaningful, with the rabbis, when they would, as you are doing right now, even moderate a conversation, their depth of rabbinics, of like Torah and thoughtfulness and the human connection would just come out. And it was like, oh my God, like, these are amazing rabbis. And it went from my head to my kishkas, this appreciation. And so that's been very transformative.
I will comfort the both of you that none of it is contagious.
Wait, none of what is contagious? Oh, going to another synagogue?
You won't catch Reform just by and Abby's not going to catch Orthodox just by hanging out there either. So I just want to comfort the two of you. It's, just be sure to wear a mask. So last question. We have time for one quick question more. I can't resist it. I want to, again, reach beyond the book. And here's the question I'd love a spontaneous response to. We've entered in many ways an unprecedented time. The vicious partisanship on every side, the overt anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, sexism, bigotry against people who don't think like you, by the left to the right, by the right to the left. There is a brittleness and a harshness to our age that has accompanied a rise in all of these prejudices. And, I can't help, being who I am, noticing it's much harder to be a Jew in many places where that was not the case in the past, and overtly violent. What can you reach into your reading of Torah to address that? Take a minute, because I didn't give you time to prepare for that, but is there something that comes out to you, a resource, a perspective, a story, a rule, something that you say, wow, in this age, this is what I want to hand out?
I mean, I'll start just because I've kind of clung to this. It's such a great question, and it's such a hard one. And your framing is completely right. And I feel like I'm not always being as honest as I feel the anxiety right now. But I just go back to the values that I often think too few Jews, or I'll speak to for my cohort, there's a lot of educated Jews who talk about Jewish values and don't really know where they are located in the Torah. And so having done this, I'm just aware of where they sit. And particularly the idea of leaving the corners of your field and not putting a stumbling block before the blind and welcoming the stranger. You know, this idea that Torah is in your mouth, is in your heart. I just feel like when people talk about universal values, like if we could get back to that, I have hope there. And I think partly because it exists there and because this text has endured, I just have to believe that the values will win out.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, last word.
You know, you might consider this a bit of a dodge because because it's not so much, I would think, a verse or a passage in the Torah, but what learning Torah is about. You know, if you want me to turn to a verse, I'll sort of say you should teach it to your children and speak about that when you rise up, when you go to bed, when you walk on the road. And an orientation to constantly being curious and wanting to learn more and understand more, because I feel so much of the way that we have become so extreme and is that we've decided our opinions. We live in our bubbles. We're only hearing the voices that reinforce our belief system. And, you know, we're quoting text, but we're quoting it to support positions we already have, as opposed to really engaging, which is what Abby and I were trying to do, not to support positions, but to work together to find an understanding. And I think that's what Chavruta models. That's what the ethos of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah, is. I never know enough, and I always have to ask, and I always want to find out more. And I think that type of curiosity and openness can do a lot to heal where we are right now.
Beautiful. So we're going to close, but I'm going to take advantage of having two of my friends here to just share a Torah insight that came to me this week. I read 2 Mishnahs a day. I love the Mishnah. It's the earliest work of rabbinic law, legend, whatever, and it's the kernel out of which the Talmud grows. And an incredible book from around the year 300 of the Common Era. And I'm in the middle of the Bavas, as are everyone who's doing 2 Mishnahs a day and on the calendar. So it tends to deal with property transfer and property law. And it turns out there are multiple ways that you transfer property and the ways that you become the owner of property. One of them, this is called kinyan. One of them is you lift something and then you walk a distance with it. And it occurs to me at every single service, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, the Jewish people do kinyan. They take ownership of the Torah. That's what we're doing when we lift it up. And when we walk it around the room, it's actually a halachic act. It's a Jewish legal act of saying, this is mine. And so you leave the service, you came into the service and it was Torah to, it was God's Torah, and you leave the service and it's Torah tenu, it's our Torah. We possess it.
So good.
And you've given us some beautiful Torah, not only in this conversation, but in this really wonderful book. I can't recommend more highly. Everyone who is online listening, run out and buy a copy for yourself and a copy for your friends.
Thank you.
And to 2 really wonderful, wonderful people, you are for me a source of hope. If we can produce people who love their Jewishness and love the Torah and mobilize it on our behalf, we're going to be just fine.